Good morning to all, and thank you for being here and listening. When I thought of this presentation, my aim was to critically examine the ambiguities and the flip sides of state-sponsored projects of public history that are presented as progressive and inclusive. Through the analysis of some initiatives of this sort in Argentina, the proposal was to identify what is achieved and what is lost with these forms of public history in terms of diversity, incorporation, and instrumentalization. I will do as promised, but the political landscape has changed considerably from the moment when I submitted this abstract, including the relationship of state politics or leading political movements with history. When I conceived this presentation as a philosopher of history, my main concern was the use of allegedly inclusive narratives to legitimize the existence of the state and the government at a merely discursive level, overpassing or even disproving the importance of redistributive policies or of violence against marginalized communities. The most evident example is a discursive inclusion of indigenous peoples as a colorful part of history, but not as political agents in the present, with claims that unsettle white ignorance and expose coloniality in the present. However, this concern seems naive, almost obscene in comparison to what we are now seeing in Argentina, as in many other countries. The front runner for the current presidential election here is someone self-defined as libertarian and conservative. Far from the up to now usual instrumental use of inclusion and the assimilation of an intellectual elite, this candidate proposes eliminating state-funded research institutions and cultural programs, and claims as his historical ancestry and that of his movement, former military and President Julio Argentino Roca, who was in charge of expanding the Argentine borders by perpetrating a massacre on indigenous nations in the north and south of the country. In this context, then, it feels odd to critique the ambiguities of an inclusion which is not such, if the future seems to bring an unmitigated defense of genocide. In a way, we are still within the realm of the various ways of using history to support political projects in the present. For this presentation, I chose to focus on the ambiguous role of public history in the agenda of self-proclaimed progressive change, but of course there are others, and perhaps today I would choose a different one. Still, it is interesting to shed light on other thorny issues beyond the most conspicuous defense of state violence. And to these more subtle ones, I will turn now. In recent decades, many states have worked on a transformation of official historical discourse with alleged intention of broadening the spectrum of identities, subjects, or collectives under their flag. From the incorporation of historical female figures in official currency, monuments, to official policies of restitution, public apologies for genocide, something smells different in much state discourse in relation to the past. This has offered stimulating opportunities to public history to become involved in community engagement and contribute to the collective creation of what is presented as a more accurate narrative and a more inclusive citizenship. This presentation will bring forth some cautions to keep in mind when considering how to respond as engaged intellectuals to these calls. As many colleagues have claimed, public history offers the opportunity to answer to social problems of the present through new ways of approaching history. My aim is to understand some potential risks of these projects when they are state-sponsored, considering their forms of cooptation and instrumentalization of historical representation. Of course, this is a risk if we understand public history as an opportunity for community engagement and hopefully for social transformation. Official interests, Costa, Almeida, and Roca claim, stagnate discourse and immobilize urgent and emerging processes of the transnational present. Needless to say, my aim is not to critique public historians that engage in these activities, but rather to contribute to internal reflections on how to relate to these possibilities that in many contexts are new and stimulating. Argentina has been all but alien to these processes of revision. There is a general agreement that official discourse regarding our country's history has undergone considerable transformation since the arrival in 2003 of the political movement that is currently in power. Public history has played a central role in this image. New historical museums, allegedly broadening the subjects, maybe not the voices, included in official narratives, changes in the calendar of public holidays, an upsurge in historical shows and documentaries in public television, transformation of former torture centers into museums of memory, among many other things. The stated aim of all this is to expand citizenship and to include those who have historically been marginalized from our country's past and present. All of this happened, But does it refer to an expansion, an inclusion, or a diversification of historical citizenship, or of what it means to be Argentine? Is it indeed, as proclaimed, a success story for community engagement on the part of public history? To answer these questions, we need to look into how these shifts were produced. And to do this, I have chosen to focus on 4 different but recurring problems in the concrete forms that state-sponsored public history has taken in Argentina through the analysis of some examples. First, inclusion as foreigners. Argentina has historically denied the existence of its Afro-descendant population through a series of myths that affirmed either their scarcity or their extinction. Afro-Argentines often denounce that, among many, many other things, they are daily faced with a question, where are you from? Which is satisfied by no answer other than naming a foreign country. Within this process of revision I referred to before, state-sponsored public history affirmed Afro-descendants as indeed part of our country. However, this was done through a series of gestures that in fact pushed them again, now implicitly, out of the realm of the nation. Consider these 2 examples. A very popular cartoon for kids airing public television, where a brown-skinned kid named Samba traveled through time and told the story, this revised story of our country. In one episode, Samba travels to 1829 and meets a Black woman who is a servant allegedly enslaved by a famous Argentine historical figure. This is an important acknowledgement that slavery from the African diaspora did exist in Argentina, and that even our most notable forefathers owned enslaved people. But political scientist Federico Pita pointed at the fact that this woman, in an interesting anachronism, speaks with a Cuban accent. Needless to say, Cuba, as we know it, did not exist at the time, and slave ships didn't come from the Caribbean, but directly from Africa. So Black people did exist, but they were here, they were from elsewhere, from a non-place, in fact. In 2010, for another example, Argentina celebrated 200 years of the beginning of our path towards independence. There were enormous celebrations, I will come back to that later. But I just wanted to point at one fact. One of the parades was called the Parade of Integration, composed of collectivities from different parts of the world that have settled in Argentina: Syria, Palestine, Japan, Paraguay, and so on. The last group that marched in this parade was a group of Afro-Argentines, introduced by the sign, "Argentina is also Afro." This phrase, in that context, sounds close to a performative contradiction, the affirmation of one thing in discourse, while its utterance in a specific context points to exactly the opposite. As we can see, these gestures of inclusion through the practice of public history reveal their own underlying beliefs, which contradict their explicitly self-attributed beliefs, or perhaps what some theories call alifs, that is, automatic or habitual mental states that are in tension with a person's explicit beliefs, but nonetheless trigger certain attitudes and behaviors in them. The second point is depoliticized inclusion. Inclusion of a historically marginalized collective can also bring along its own conditions and requirements. This is the case with indigenous peoples. A lot can be said of the shortcomings of this process of inclusion, most notably the fact that they tend to be included as part of the past, but not as a present. Many people have written about this. I have too, and there I mention my paper. Here, I would like to focus on another point brought forth by historian and theorist of history Mario Rufer. Rufer stresses how the inclusion of indigenous peoples often came at the price of pitting memory against rights. The state, a white settler colonial state, opens a space for these subjects to speak, but does not allow for just any sort of speech. The language of rights, most notably claims of land and against the alliance of the government with foreign capital, is not permitted for them. Rufer quotes Mario Barrios, leader of an indigenous group, who said, "And now it looks like we can come with our dresses and our things, but without talking about the pillage of land, for example. That is a story of how we were left with nothing from then until now. The same always. But they don't want to talk about that either, no matter how much they talk about rights." Public history has been vital for the discursive inclusion of indigenous peoples in this era of Argentine politics, an era which, as I said before, might be coming to an end. But this inclusion, as I say, has been little more than discursive. In 2014, the president re-inaugurated a room in the House of Government in Buenos Aires, which was previously called Christopher Columbus and was renamed Room of Native Peoples. In her inaugural speech, the president referred briefly to this new setting and name, alluded to our indigenous peoples, and then moved on to discuss completely unrelated topics. She did address the divisions that have characterized Argentine history, but did not mention the one between civilization and barbarity that, since the beginning of our history, has set the ground with those terms for the exclusion of indigenous peoples. In short, the only thing related to the indigenous peoples in this room or in the policies that surround it is its name. Inclusion is achieved, paraphrasing Dean Spade, by getting rid of the bad things, in this case, Christopher Columbus, and replacing them with good things in the writing, in the law, in this case, indigenous peoples. So that would be the second problem I find. The third one is the monopolization of memory. One of the most distinct and positive aspects of the official scheme in public history during this period in Argentina was the reinvigoration of memory as an important part of state politics. In 2011, a law was passed to identify and preserve sites of memory. 807 sites have been identified, and over 40 of them function as museums, research centers that are visited by hundreds of people every year. Striking, however, and worrying is the extremely restricted use of this notion. Let us take a closer look at the sites of memory in Argentina. This is the definition you see there of sites of memory given by the law. Within these temporal boundaries, the direction of sites of memory focused on the period 1974-1983. This restricts state violence to a specific period, which is perceived as almost ontologically different, and excludes violence perpetrated by the state in periods that have an undeniable continuity with the present, most notably other democratically chosen governments led by the same movement that implements these policies, and the genocide perpetrated on indigenous populations. In fact, the direction of sites of memory, as you see there, refers to a number of practices perpetrated by state terrorism in the 1970s, clandestine detention, torture, extermination, and so forth. But these actions were also what constituted the indigenous genocide that is often not always left out of memory sites. So there has been a growth of initiatives in public history related to memory, but their performative strength lies also in establishing and reinforcing the boundaries of horror through the tireless repetition of the stark connection between memory and state violence under the last military dictatorship. Thus, once again, by affirming and including, public history also produces an exclusion and a hierarchy. The fourth point, I named it no contingency, no betrayal. This was brought home to me when reading Rufer's analysis of memory policies. Rufer refers at one point to the Bolivian case and notes that at the time of writing, 2016, the state narrative had turned its back to the elites by pointing at the contingency of power relations between white settlers and indigenous populations. In my reading, the official Argentine narrative, on the contrary, never exposed this contingency. Therefore, its narrative never betrayed the elites. By way of example, we can go back to the commemorations of independence in 2010. Among the events planned for the occasion, many included some form of historical narration, for example, a projection of an animation on a historical building in Buenos Aires recounting our 200 years of life, or a parade with 19 floats that highlighted various outstanding moments and landmarks. All of these narrations presented a continuity, a harmonious succession with incorporation of new agents into the life of the nation. None of these had any reference to state violence apart from that perpetrated by the military regimes. No mention was done of settler colonialism or to genocide. It is important to stress that these were indeed inclusive narratives. In the parade, for instance, indigenous people had their own float, but it was the first one, after which the nation started, which appeared as a woman floating over the street, with no references to indigenous peoples thereafter. In the float dedicated to social movements, there was no reference to historical indigenous marches. The representation of European migration did not mention the displacement of indigenous populations by settlers, nor did it mention the massacres and displacement that took place around the same years to expand the national borders. As Rufer also notes in his analysis of these commemorations, they never moved beyond the already familiar narrative. But there's more. They managed not to move beyond the familiar narrative while conveying a sense of transformation by including these collectives. As Paula Salerno has noted in her analysis of presidential discourses, although the president reformulates national history, she does it by stressing the values already embedded in the official discourse of history, even while proposing other protagonists. And there, in this conjunction of tradition and apparent novelty, lies its efficacy. So, to conclude, the Argentine state has implemented, especially between 2003 and 2015, a variety of initiatives that mobilize public history to support a process that is presented under a sign of commemoration, diversity, and inclusion. There's lots to say for each of these words. Collectives such as indigenous nations and Afro-descendants have been mentioned by official discourse as the latest incorporations in this trajectory. However, how these incorporations are practiced in official projects shows a gap between the affirmation of inclusion and the actual understanding of the nation and citizenship. What these representations seem to advance is the legitimation of the state, more specifically, the administration speaking in the name of the state and in the name of the nation, as the fulfillment of the greatest historical figures and the most progressive step in a harmonious linear trajectory towards a great nation. So that's my presentation. I'm open for questions. Thank you very much.